A woman spending time with her family on a normal Saturday morning heard the doorbell ring and went to answer it. What happened next resembled more the plot of a horror movie than a real-life incident. It took the detectives more than 30 years to unravel this terrible mystery, the ending of which shocked and angered everyone. Marlene Warren was born on April 15, 1950, in Michigan, USA. She grew up without a father, and since her teenage years, dreamed of having a large and close-knit family. Very soon, that dream came true. The girl married a man named John, and they had 2 sons. But just a few years later, an unexpected tragedy struck the family. Marlene's husband died suddenly of an illness, and the woman was left alone with 2 small children. Since then, she has spent most of her time at work, trying to provide for her sons alone. Although she struggled with this, she sacrificed everything for her children. 6 years after her husband's death, she met a man named Michael Warren, and they soon married. The man was a used car salesman, and after their marriage, he opened his own business in that area. By that time, Marlene was already making good money, but instead of spending all her money, she tried to save it. The woman invested in Michael's company and also helped him in the management. The man himself was also good at this business, and in the following years, it began to bring them decent money. Over time, Marlene and her husband expanded the business. They bought several properties to rent, and their finances took off. The family moved to an upscale Miami suburb called Wellington, buying a large house there. They seemed to have built a near-perfect life, but in 1988, Marlene suffered another tragedy. Her oldest son was killed in a car accident. For the woman and her youngest son, Joseph, it was a huge blow. After all the difficulties they had gone through, their life had just got better when suddenly fate presented them with yet another test. Yet they found the strength to move on. After this tragedy, Marlene became even closer to Joseph because he was her only closest relative. Her husband also helped her to recover from this loss. After the death of her son, the woman began to think about selling the properties that she and Michael were renting out. Despite the fact that this business brought in good money, for Marlene it was associated with constant worries. There were often situations when tenants delayed rent or lost income altogether. In each such case, the woman did her best to find the best solution. It was very hard for her to put people on the street because she was a good-natured person and well remembered the financial difficulties she experienced with 2 small children. On the other hand, she and her husband could not let people live in their homes for free, and eventually Marlene wanted to get rid of the business so that she would no longer face such moral dilemmas. 2 years had passed since her son's death. The family was just beginning to recover and return to normalcy, but something terrible and unforeseen awaited them once again. On the morning of May 26, 1990, Marlene was at home with her son and 3 of his friends who came over for breakfast. Their kitchen was located so that they could see the driveway through the windows. At some point, the doorbell rang and Marlene went to open it. Her son saw a white Chrysler parked in front of their house. The next second, the woman opened the front door and saw a man in a clown costume holding 2 balloons and a bouquet of flowers on the doorstep. Marlene said, "How cute is that?" But the next second, something unexpected happened. The clown pulled a gun out of his pocket and shot the woman in the head. Her son and his friends rushed into the hallway where a heartbreaking sight awaited them. Marlene was lying on the floor with blood everywhere. The man in the clown suit looked at them for a few seconds, then got back into his car and drove away. My son called an ambulance, after which he decided to chase after his attacker. At the time, his leg was in a cast after an injury and the guy couldn't drive. He told his two friends to stay with his mother, asked his friend to drive, and drove with her in the direction the attacker had gone. But by that time, the clown was out of sight and they never managed to find him. Marlene was taken to the hospital in an unconscious state, and the detectives began their investigation. The first thing they did was talk to everyone in the house. The woman's son said that he could not see any signs of his attacker. He was wearing a suit and makeup. He was wearing gloves on his hands and a wig on his head. The only thing the son remembered was that the perpetrator had very dark eyes. His friends added that the clown was quite tall, and his shoes stood out strongly against the costume. They looked like work shoes. A neighbor who was walking his dog near Marlene's house also saw the clown, but he was unable to share any significant sightings with police. Investigators put out a search for a white Chrysler and began searching for other evidence. Of course, Marlene's husband, Michael, was the first to be suspected. That morning, he had just left for the racing stadium in Miami, and at the time of the attack on his wife, he was not at home. From the first hours of the investigation, the police had several good reasons to think about his involvement. First, they found out that Marlene and her relatives really liked clowns. There were a lot of pictures and figures depicting these characters in their house. This suggested that the attacker knew this fact and chose such an outfit for a reason. Secondly, just 2 hours after the incident, the police received an anonymous tip from a woman who called the investigators and said they should look into Michael Warren and a woman named Sheila Keene. Sheila, who was 26, worked with Michael at his car rental company. Digging deeper, the detectives learned of rumors that there was a secret affair between them. Their relationship had been speculated about by some colleagues, so they immediately shared this information with investigators. Here the police discovered another possible motive. If Michael was in a relationship with another woman and wanted to break up with Marlene, he had one problem. Most of the real estate and business that the family owned were written down to his wife. In that case, Michael would lose an impressive part of his fortune in a divorce. The police immediately checked the man's whereabouts at the time of the attack, and it turned out that Michael was in a car about 110 kilometers away from the house and had two friends with him. Investigators concluded he would not have been physically capable of committing the crime. Upon learning of the attempt on his wife's life, Michael rushed to the hospital and has not left her room since. Officers spoke with Sheila, and she stated that there was no romantic relationship between them, and she had nothing to do with the crime. The woman added that she was at work at the time. Detectives also interviewed Sheila's husband, who said he was aware of rumors of an affair between his wife and Michael, but could not confirm whether or not it was true. The man added that his wife had moved out about a month ago, and in fact, they were no longer together. Although the police had no evidence to link Michael and Sheila to the crime, they continued to consider their involvement highly probable. Given that the husband could not have physically been outside his house that morning, the police wondered, could Sheila have been the clown? Because of the costume, none of the witnesses could determine the gender of the assailant for certain, and Sheila was known among her colleagues for her character. The woman was responsible for dealing with clients who were delinquent in their rent payments. In most of these cases, she had to take the car away from them, and in this, Sheila was adamant. Some of these cases led to serious conflicts, so the woman always carried a gun with her. After doctors removed the bullet from Marlene's head, Experts determined that it had been fired from a .38 caliber handgun, remarkably the same caliber as Sheila's. The cops went to her again to examine the weapon, but the woman said the gun had been stolen or lost months before the incident, and the detectives were again left with nothing. The cops continued to dig deeper and learned that after Sheila moved out of her husband's house, she had moved into a rental apartment, and investigators also heard rumors that Michael was paying for the place. Here, a new interesting discovery awaited the police officers. All the while, their colleagues were trying to establish where the perpetrator took the clown costume, balloons, and flowers. At first glance, it seemed a very difficult task, but the detectives were lucky they found that on May 24th, 2 days before the attempt on Marlene's life, a woman came to the costume store near Sheila's apartment. The employee said that at the time, the store was closed and they were about to leave, but the woman persistently knocked on the door until someone opened it for her. She stated that she urgently needed a clown costume, a wig, face makeup, and a red nose. The clerks tried to explain to her that the store was already closed and asked her to come back tomorrow, but the woman was adamant, so the staff still sold her the items. There were no surveillance cameras in the store, so the police officers had to rely on verbal description of the woman's appearance. The salespeople told them that she was tall and thin with dark hair. Detectives showed them pictures of several women, and the officer said the customer looked like one of them, Sheila. As for the balloons and flowers, they were traced to a supermarket about a mile from Sheila's apartment. The salesman stated that the same items had been bought by a woman just a few hours before the attempt on Marlene's life. He described her exactly like the costume store employees, a tall, thin young woman with long dark hair. The salesman added another interesting fact. According to him, the female customer exhibited rude and to some extent even masculine manners. By that time, the investigation had lasted 2 days, and on May 28th, the doctors told the police that Marlene had died. Despite their best efforts, the effects of the point-blank shot were too severe. As a result, the case was reclassified as a homicide, and detectives continued to look for more possible evidence against Sheila. They asked the judge for a warrant to search her apartment. While the police were waiting, something else happened. They were informed of a similar car in a parking lot located 13 kilometers from the victim's home. Investigators got there and quickly verified that it was the same Chrysler the killer was driving. Inside, they found some long dark hair and orange fibers that looked like pieces of a clown wig. During a search of Sheila's apartment, the police found the exact same orange-colored particles, and they also found work boots that matched the witness's description, a similar model worn by the clown on the day of the murder. Despite all this, the police had one major problem. DNA analysis was barely used at the time, and without it, all this evidence was circumstantial. A high probability the court would have acquitted Sheila, in which case it would be impossible to charge her again with murder. Then the detectives wondered, where did the car the clown drove to Marlene's house come from? And then they found out something very interesting. An employee of Michael's company told them that 1.5 months before Marlene's murder, they had received a call from a man to rent a rental car. But there was one problem. This man had mixed up the phone numbers and he had taken the car from another company, the main competitors of Michael. When the employee told the boss about it, Michael behaved very strangely. Instead of telling the customer about his mistake, he told the man to just bring the car to the parking lot and leave the keys in the cabin. Then Michael asked the employee to bring him and Sheila to the parking lot and never to tell anyone about what had happened. The employee watched as they got into that car and drove away. It was the same white Chrysler. Notably, not long before that, there had been a serious disagreement between Michael and his competitors. The problem was that Michael was portraying his competitors in a bad light in his advertising, and they didn't like their brand being portrayed in a negative light. Detectives decided to look into Michael's business in more detail. During the audit, they found numerous violations of the law, including tax and insurance manipulation. Moreover, they found evidence that Michael sometimes resorted to illegal methods of returning cars, even when customers paid on time and did not violate any terms. During this audit, the police also spoke to an employee who recalled something interesting. According to him, Michael and Marlene once had an argument in the workplace. When the woman left, Michael asked the employee, "How much would you charge to make my wife disappear?" Although it all sounded highly suspicious, detectives still had no evidence linking Michael to the murder. He was nevertheless arrested for various business manipulations. The court initially sentenced the man to 8 years in prison, but he was released after 4 years. Later, in 2002, Michael married Sheila and they moved to another state. Even though the detectives were never able to prove their involvement in the murder, they continued to watch them. The cops discovered that after the move, Sheila began introducing herself to everyone she knew under a different name, Debbie, and that she had dyed her hair from dark to blonde. She and Michael opened their restaurant, and it seemed that they had managed to build a wonderful life in the new place. However, soon rumors began to circulate among the employees of their establishment that Sheila had murdered Michael's ex-wife. Apparently, one of them stumbled across information about this crime and learned that the police still suspected them. However, detectives still could not prove their guilt, and the case finally froze. It wasn't reopened until 2013, and a new team of investigators requested a re-examination of all available evidence. By then, technology in the examination of DNA and other physical evidence had advanced to a new level compared to 1990. It took several years to examine the evidence. First, experts compared the orange flecks found in Sheila's apartment, the car, and the murder scene, and analysis showed they were identical. But the biggest clue was waiting ahead. Experts took a DNA sample from several hairs found in the white Chrysler and compared them to Sheila's DNA. They were a perfect match. Detectives thus obtained incontrovertible evidence that Sheila was in the very car in which the clown drove up to Marlene's house, enough to take the case to court, and the woman was arrested in 2017. At the time, Sheila was 54 and still denied guilt. She was denied the right to bail and awaited trial in a cell. As for Michael, he insisted that he had nothing to do with Marlene's murder and believed that Sheila had nothing to do with it either. He hired expensive attorneys for her, and the wait for the trial stretched on for years. In preparation for it, the police uncovered some facts not previously known. It turned out that a year after the murder, they were approached by a lawyer who had worked with Michael on his business. He said that about a year before the murder, Michael had asked him an extremely odd question. If the husband kills his wife, what happens to the property recorded in her name? Will the husband get it? The lawyer was surprised by such a question, but that didn't stop him from actually giving Michael advice. He said that if the husband asked his acquaintance to commit this murder and the court could not tie the husband to the man, he would get all his wife's property. But the lawyer went on to say something that later shocked investigators. He told Michael that if the killer wore some sort of costume, such as a clown, he would never be identified and would escape punishment. Another shocking confession came from a man whose father worked for Michael at the time of the murder. He confessed that his now deceased father had helped to run illegal schemes at extra cost, such as swiping mileage meters to sell cars at a higher price. But on the day of the murder, Michael asked him to do something far more terrible. He told the man to get rid of the gun and of the car. Apparently, the car in question was the one in which the killer moved after he abandoned the Chrysler in the parking lot, and the employee complied with these requests. Before he died, he told all this to his son and added another important detail. The man said that the second car was hidden in the river canal. As soon as the police received this information from his son, they combed the canal and indeed found the car there. Unfortunately, no evidence of it survived, but the very fact that it was there confirmed that the witness was telling the truth. The beginning of Sheila's trial was repeatedly postponed until finally a final date was set for May 12, 2023. But on April 25th, something unexpected happened. The woman pleaded guilty in exchange for not receiving the death penalty, which she would face if she were to lose her murder trial. Her attorneys explained the situation as follows. Sheila is innocent of the murder, but she fears for her life, which is why she took responsibility for someone else's crime. However, there is a much more logical explanation. Under the terms of the deal, she pleaded guilty to murder in the second degree, which implies a sentence of 12 years in prison, which is exactly the sentence she received. But furthermore interesting, the court deducted from that term the time the woman spent behind bars since her arrest, about 5.5 years. But that is not all. The judge reduced the remaining term due to the good behavior of Sheila. As a result, the woman was to spend between 16 and 24 months in prison. Her attorneys assured her that they could secure her release after the minimum bar of that time expired. So, Sheila was found guilty of murdering a woman in cold blood in front of her son and received a frankly ludicrous sentence for it. As for Michael, his involvement is still unproven and he remains free. Most likely he will never be charged again for the murder of his wife because there is not a single piece of evidence against him. Despite all this, the son of Marlene thanked the detectives who were able to get to the truth and did not give up on the case for many years. The death of his mother was the strongest tragedy for him because she was his only relative. Nevertheless, he was able to cope with the pain, opened his own small construction firm, and got his life together. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you liked it. Thanks for watching.